Story number 1.
The pool was the centerpiece of Cedar Grove Apartments, its turquoise water sparkling under the flickering light of an old lamppost. On summer evenings, children splashed and screamed with delight, and adults lounged in plastic chairs, sipping drinks. But by fall, when the nights grew colder and the water sat still and empty, the pool took on a strange presence, like it was waiting. The rumors started years ago, whispered among tenants. A young girl named Emily had drowned there one night, her body found floating face down by the janitor. She was just 8 years old, her pale hand clutching the edge of the pool as if she'd tried to pull herself out. The official story blamed an accident. No lifeguard, no one watching, but some swore they'd heard something darker. Claire didn't believe in ghosts. At 24, she'd just moved into the apartments, eager to start fresh after her breakup. She loved her third-floor unit overlooking the pool. It felt peaceful, and the faint chlorine smell reminded her of childhood summers. One October night, after a long day at her new job, Claire decided to unwind by the pool. The complex was quiet, most tenants holed up inside. She took her book and a glass of wine, sitting close enough to dip her toes in the water. It was a crisp, clear night, and the reflection of the moon rippled on the surface. The stillness was comforting until she felt it. A chill, not from the air, but something deeper, something that seemed to rise from the water itself. She glanced around. No one was there, but the faint sound of splashing broke the silence. Claire leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pool. The water was empty, perfectly still, except for the faintest ripple spreading outward. A shiver ran up her spine. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She sat back, trying to shake off the unease. She told herself it was the wine, the stress, the loneliness. But when she looked at the pool again, her breath caught. A small handprint, wet and glistening, appeared on the concrete edge. Claire froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't touched the water, and there was no one else around. The handprint was too small to belong to an adult. She grabbed her things and hurried back to her apartment, locking the door behind her. That night, she dreamed of the pool. In her dream, the water was darker, almost black, and something was moving just beneath the surface. She could hear a child's laughter, high and echoing, but it didn't sound happy. It sounded mocking. The next morning, Claire dismissed it as stress. But over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. Her bathroom mirror fogged up on its own, even though she hadn't showered. When she wiped it clean, the word play appeared, written in small, uneven letters. She started hearing faint splashes at night, even when her windows were closed. One evening, she heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find no one there, just a trail of wet footprints leading down the hallway. By the second week, Claire was terrified. She confided in her neighbor, Mrs. Hall, an older woman who had lived there for decades. "Emily," Mrs. Hall said, her voice low. "The little girl who drowned, she used to knock on doors, asking people to come swim with her. That's how she lured them." Claire's stomach turned. "You're saying she's still here?" Mrs. Hall shrugged. "Some say they've seen her, heard her. The pool's cursed, honey. I don't go near it after dark." That night, Claire couldn't sleep. Every creak of her apartment made her jump. Around midnight, she heard it again, the faint splashing. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. She crept into her living room, her heart pounding. Water dripped from her ceiling, forming a small puddle on the floor. But when she looked up, the ceiling was dry. Claire couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed down to the pool, determined to prove to herself that there was nothing there. The air was icy, far colder than it should have been for October. The pool was eerily still, the surface like glass. Claire shined her flashlight across it, her breath visible in the cold air. At first, there was nothing, just the empty pool and the soft hum of the lamppost. But then, at the far end, she saw it, a figure, small and pale, standing at the edge of the water. It was a little girl, her wet hair hanging in clumps around her face. She wore an old-fashioned bathing suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. Her head was tilted, her eyes wide and unblinking. Claire's knees buckled. "Emily?" she whispered. The girl didn't answer. She just pointed at the water. "Go away," Claire stammered. "You're not real." The girl tilted her head the other way, her lips curling into a grin. Then she stepped into the pool, sinking beneath the surface without a ripple. Claire turned to run, but she slipped on the wet concrete, falling hard on her side. When she looked up, Emily was in front of her, water streaming from her hair and eyes, black as the void. "Play with me," the girl said, her voice echoing like it was underwater. Claire screamed, scrambling to her feet and running back to her apartment. She locked the door and didn't sleep, her back pressed against the wall until dawn. The next day, she packed her things and left Cedar Grove without looking back. Years later, she still dreams of Emily, her pale face and black eyes haunting her in the dark, and sometimes when she's near a pool, she swears she hears a faint splash, followed by the soft, mocking laughter of a child. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The swimming pool at Silver Pines Country Club had been closed for nearly a decade, a relic of better days. Encased by rusting fences and overgrown weeds, its water had turned a sickly green, a breeding ground for mosquitoes and local myths. Kids dared each other to climb over the fence at night, but most didn't go near it. Not after what happened to Jake Warner. Jake was a lifeguard at the pool when it was still the pride of the town. By all accounts, he loved his job, even though his coworkers teased him for being overly cautious. One late August evening, Jake stayed behind to clean up after a busy day. He never made it home. His body was found floating in the deep end the next morning, a life buoy still clutched in his hand. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, but whispers spread about Jake's death. Some said his body was found with bruises around his ankles like something had dragged him under. After the club closed, the rumors only grew. People swore they saw ripples in the water when no one was there. Others claimed to hear faint splashing late at night. When Kate moved into the area, she wasn't aware of the pool's sinister reputation. She'd just started college and was renting a room in a house a few blocks away. The pool wasn't visible from the road, but Kate often passed the overgrown entrance on her morning jogs. One evening, her roommates convinced her to join them for a bonfire near the pool. "It's tradition," her roommate Lisa said, grinning as she handed Kate a flashlight. "We do it every fall to welcome new people." Kate followed them through the woods, her flashlight beam bouncing off tangled roots and fallen branches. When they reached the fence, her heart sank. The pool looked far worse than she'd imagined. The once blue tiles were cracked and coated in grime, and the water was a murky, opaque green. "Creepy, right?" Lisa said, throwing her bag down near the fence. "Why would anyone swim in this?" Kate asked, wrinkling her nose. "They didn't," Lisa replied. "Not after Jake." Kate frowned. "Who's Jake?" Lisa hesitated, then launched into the story. The others chimed in, embellishing details until the tale sounded like something out of a horror movie. "That's just a story," Kate said, though she couldn't help glancing back at the water. "Right?" Lisa shrugged. "You'd think so, but last year Amanda swore she saw someone standing in the pool, and 2 years before that, Kyle heard a voice calling his name from the deep end." "Stop," Kate said with a laugh, though her stomach churned. As the night wore on, the group roasted marshmallows and told more ghost stories. Kate tried to relax, but she kept glancing at the pool. It was unnervingly still, like it was holding its breath. Around midnight, the group decided to head back, but Kate realized she'd left her phone near the fence. She volunteered to grab it, waving off Lisa's offer to go with her. The others waited by the trees as Kate approached the pool. The flashlight's beam swept across the cracked concrete, illuminating her phone. She grabbed it quickly and turned to leave, but something made her pause. A ripple spread across the water. Kate froze. The night was completely silent, no wind, no animals. She told herself it was just a fish or a frog, but the pool had been abandoned for years. Then she saw it. A shadow under the surface, barely visible in the murky water. It wasn't an animal. It was shaped like a person, swimming slowly toward her. Her throat tightened. She stepped back, the flashlight trembling in her hand. "Guys?" she called out, her voice cracking. No one answered. The shadow moved closer, and Kate stumbled, nearly dropping the flashlight. When she looked again, the water was still. The shadow was gone. Kate bolted back to the group, her heart racing. She didn't tell them what she saw, afraid they'd laugh or think she was trying to scare them. But that night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the moment she saw the shadow. It wasn't just its shape that unnerved her. It was the way it moved. Purposeful. Deliberate. Over the next few weeks, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She stopped going on jogs near the pool and avoided the woods altogether. Then one night, she woke to the sound of splashing. It was faint, almost like it was coming from a dream. But as she sat up in bed, the sound grew louder, more distinct. She glanced at her window. Her room was on the second floor, but the faint smell of chlorine wafted through the air. Terrified, she turned on the light and checked the room. Nothing was out of place, but when she looked out the window, she saw wet footprints leading away from the house. The next morning, Lisa found Kate sitting at the kitchen table, pale and sleep-deprived. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked. Kate hesitated, then told her everything. The shadow in the pool, the splashing, the footprints. Lisa's face grew serious. "You shouldn't have gone back to the pool," she said. "They say once you see it, it follows you." "What follows you?" Kate demanded. Lisa leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake?" Kate tried to brush it off, but the haunting escalated. Water would appear in her sink, though she hadn't used it. Her bathroom mirror fogged up, revealing the faint outline of a handprint. One night, she woke to find her room filled with the smell of chlorine. Her bed was damp, the sheets clinging to her skin. The final straw came when she heard it, a voice, low and distorted, whispering her name. Kate packed her things and moved out the next day. She never went near the pool again, but she still dreams about it sometimes. In her dreams, she's standing at the edge, staring into the dark water, and every time she sees the shadow waiting just beneath the surface. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The Crestwood Community Center's indoor swimming pool had been closed for months. It was supposed to reopen in the spring after renovations, but budget cuts delayed the work. Now, in late fall, the building sat abandoned, its once busy halls silent. The pool itself, drained and forgotten, became a place of eerie fascination for the town's teenagers, who swapped stories about why the renovations had stopped. Sam wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but when his best friend Alex dared him to explore the pool one Friday night, he didn't back down. "It's just an empty building," Sam had said, shoving a flashlight into his jacket pocket. "What's the worst that could happen?" Alex smirked. "We'll see if you're still saying that when you hear the screams." Sam rolled his eyes but felt a flicker of unease. According to the rumors, a young boy named Dylan had drowned in the pool years ago during a late-night swim. The lifeguard on duty hadn't noticed until it was too late. People claimed the boy's spirit lingered, still searching for help that would never come. The boys arrived at the community center just after midnight. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights flickering overhead. Alex had managed to pick the lock on the side door earlier that week, so they slipped inside without a problem. The air was heavy with the smell of chlorine, even though the pool had been drained. Their footsteps echoed as they made their way down the dark hallway toward the pool area. "You scared yet?" Alex whispered, his grin barely visible in the dim light. "Not even close," Sam muttered, though his hand tightened on the flashlight. When they entered the pool room, the vast emptiness took Sam's breath away. The pool itself yawned like a giant crater, its tiled walls stained and cracked. The high windows let in slivers of moonlight and casting eerie shadows across the floor. Alex hopped down into the empty pool, his sneakers scraping against the tiles. "See? Nothing to it. Just an old pool." Sam stayed on the edge, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen. "Come on," Alex called. "It's not scary if you just stand there." Reluctantly, Sam climbed down, his shoes skidding slightly on the slick surface. As he joined Alex in the deep end, a sudden cold breeze made him shiver. "Did you feel that?" Sam asked. Alex shrugged. "Probably just the wind." "There's no wind in here," Sam said, his voice low. Before Alex could respond, a faint sound broke the stillness. It was soft at first, like the distant hum of a fan. But as it grew louder, Sam realized it wasn't mechanical. It was splashing. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his flashlight darting nervously across the pool. "Yeah," Alex said, his cocky demeanor fading. The splashing grew louder, echoing off the walls. It sounded like someone swimming, their hands breaking the surface of water that wasn't there. Alex laughed nervously. "Okay, someone's messing with us. Let's just..." Before he could finish, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Sam saw movement. "Alex, look!" he hissed, pointing to the shallow end of the pool. A small puddle of water was forming, spreading slowly across the dry tiles. Okay, that's weird, Alex said, backing away. The puddle began to ripple, as if something unseen was disturbing it. Sam's chest tightened. We need to go, he said, grabbing Alex's arm. But Alex didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the water, which was now bubbling and churning. Sam, Alex whispered. What is that? Sam followed his gaze and froze. Rising from the puddle was a figure, translucent and shimmering like water. It was the shape of a child, no taller than 4 feet, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through them. Sam's breath caught in his throat. Dylan, he murmured, the name slipping out before he could stop himself. The figure tilted its head as if it had heard him. Then, in a voice that was both faint and piercing, it spoke. Help me. Sam didn't wait to hear more. He yanked Alex toward the edge of the pool, his legs trembling as he scrambled out. Go! Go! He shouted, but Alex hesitated, his gaze still locked on the figure. Alex, Sam yelled, his voice cracking. The figure began to move, gliding across the pool floor toward Alex. Its outstretched hand left a trail of wet footprints on the dry tiles. Finally snapping out of his daze, Alex bolted. The boys sprinted out of the pool room, the sound of splashing chasing them down the hallway. When they burst outside, gasping for air, they didn't stop running until they reached Sam's car. For a long time, they sat in silence, their breaths ragged. What the hell was that? Alex finally asked, his voice trembling. I don't know, Sam said, gripping the steering wheel. But it wasn't a story. It's real. They never went back to the pool, and neither of them spoke of that night again. But sometimes late at night, Sam would wake to the sound of faint splashing outside his bedroom window. And once, just once, he thought he saw a small wet handprint on the glass. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The summer camp where I worked for 2 years in high school was famous for its massive swimming pool. Camp Horizon boasted the largest outdoor pool in the state, complete with a high diving board, twisting slides, and a shallow waiting area for kids. It was the crown jewel of the camp, where most of the activities took place. But there was another pool at Horizon, hidden deep in the woods on the far side of the campgrounds. Officially, it had been closed for decades, but rumors about it never seemed to die. Everyone called it the Bottomless Pool, though its official name was simply Pool B. Nobody used Pool B anymore, but the stories about it never went away. Campers whispered about a boy who had drowned there years ago. His name was Ethan, and the legend claimed he had been the last camper allowed to swim in Pool B before it was shut down. People said he never left. The first time I heard about Pool B was during staff orientation. A senior counselor named Jeremy told the story as part of the camp's traditional initiation. Ethan was 7, Jeremy began, his voice low and dramatic. His group went swimming after dinner, even though the pool wasn't well lit. No one noticed when he slipped under. By the time they found him, it was too late. They say his body sank to the bottom and never came back up. Now, late at night, you can hear him calling for help. Most of us laughed it off, but there was something in Jeremy's tone that unsettled me. He sounded less like he was telling a story and more like he was reliving it. Weeks passed, and the summer went on as usual. Days were packed with canoe races, arts and crafts, and nightly campfires. I loved my job, though the long hours often left me drained. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I was cleaning up near the main pool when Jeremy approached me. He looked pale, his usual grin replaced with a serious expression. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked abruptly. I shrugged. "Not really." "Why?" "Pool B," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "Something's wrong with it." I raised an eyebrow. "You're not still trying to scare me, are you?" Jeremy shook his head. "I'm serious. A few nights ago, I went out there with some of the other staff, just to check it out. We heard things, splashing, voices, have the water look like it was moving, even though the pool's been drained for years." I laughed nervously. "Come on, it's just an old, empty pool. Probably animals or the wind." He grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Don't go out there alone. Promise me." I nodded, more to appease him than anything else, but his words stuck with me. 2 nights later, I found myself restless after lights out. The camp was quiet, the counselors either asleep or gathered at the staff lounge. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Without really thinking about it, I started toward the woods. Curiosity tugged at me, and before I knew it, I was heading in the direction of Pool B. The path was overgrown and dark, the moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy above. I nearly turned back twice, but something urged me forward. When I finally reached the clearing, my breath caught in my throat. Pool B was eerie, even more so than I'd imagined. The concrete basin was cracked and stained, vines creeping over its edges. Despite being drained for years, the air smelled faintly of chlorine. I stepped closer, my flashlight casting long shadows. The bottom of the pool was littered with debris, leaves, twigs, and what looked like an old toy boat. Then I heard it. A splash. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, the sound of something breaking the surface of water. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I edged closer to the pool, shining my flashlight across the empty basin. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a faint ripple spreading across the middle of the pool. But there was no water. My stomach twisted. I stepped back, ready to run, when a voice stopped me cold. "Help me." It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to root me in place. I turned the flashlight toward the center of the pool, and that's when I saw him. A boy, no older than 7, standing in the middle of the empty basin. His hair was dripping wet, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and pleading. "Help me," he said again, his voice echoing strangely. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice trembling. The boy tilted his head, a sad smile creeping onto his face. Before I could move, he stepped forward, only he didn't walk. He glided, his bare feet never touching the ground. I turned and bolted, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the crunch of leaves under my feet. When I reached the staff cabin, I slammed the door behind me, gasping for air. Jeremy was sitting on the couch, his face pale as he looked up at me. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. We never told the other staff or campers what happened. Jeremy warned me not to talk about it, saying it would only make things worse. That summer, I finished my job and left Camp Horizon, vowing never to return. But Ethan never truly left me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of splashing, and once when I walked past a neighborhood pool, I swear I heard a voice, soft, pleading, and unmistakable. "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 5.
The Willow Creek Aquatic Center had been a staple of the community for decades. The building, once vibrant and buzzing with families and competitive swimmers, now stood abandoned, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows broken. The city had closed the center 10 years ago after an incident that no one liked to talk about. I first learned about it during my freshman year of college when I came back to Willow Creek for the summer. My older cousin Ben, always one for urban exploration, suggested we check it out one evening. "It's creepy as hell," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "And there's this story about the diving pool. People swear it's haunted." I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, right. Haunted pools? That's a new one." Ben smirked. "You'll see. There's something wrong with that place. People hear things, screams, splashes, even voices calling their names, and no one swims there anymore, obviously." Despite my skepticism, I agreed to go. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I had to admit the idea of sneaking into an old abandoned pool sounded thrilling. We went after midnight, armed with flashlights and a pair of bolt cutters for the chain link fence surrounding the property. The summer air was heavy and humid, the crickets louder than usual as we crept through the overgrown weeds. The building loomed ahead, its once white walls now a dingy gray. As we stepped inside, the faint smell of chlorine lingered in the air, mingling with mildew and decay. "Smells like someone still cleansed this place," I joked, but my voice sounded hollow in the cavernous space. Ben laughed quietly. "Maybe the ghosts are neat freaks." The main pool was a shallow, rectangular basin that had once been lined with bright blue tiles. Now it was filled with stagnant rainwater, the surface slick with algae. The lanes were still marked by faint white lines, and the diving boards stood like skeletal sentinels at the far end. "This is it," Ben said, gesturing to the diving pool. The diving pool was deeper than I expected, its drained basin disappearing into darkness. I shined my flashlight over the edge, but the beam barely reached the bottom. The pool seemed to go on forever, an optical illusion that made my stomach churn. "Looks like a black hole," I muttered. "Exactly." Ben said. That's why people call it the abyss. They say a girl drowned here during a swim meet. She hit her head on the diving board, and no one noticed until it was too late. By the time they pulled her out, it was like the water had swallowed her. Some people think she never left. I rolled my eyes, and now she haunts the pool, right? Classic campfire story. Ben shrugged. Believe what you want, but weird stuff happens here. As if on cue, the temperature seemed to drop. I shivered, glancing around. Did you feel that? I asked. Ben nodded, his expression suddenly serious. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside. Then, from somewhere deep within the pool, came a noise, a soft splash, like someone dipping their hand in water. Did you hear that? I whispered. Ben nodded again, his flashlight trembling slightly. The splash came again, louder this time, followed by a faint ripple spreading across the surface of the stagnant rainwater. Okay, that's enough for me, I said, stepping back. But Ben was transfixed, his eyes fixed on the pool. Wait, he said, there's something down there. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach twist. A shadow moved beneath the water, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a fish or debris, it was the shape of a person, gliding silently through the murk. Ben, let's go, I hissed, grabbing his arm. He didn't move. Ben! The shadow stopped, hovering just below the surface. Then, slowly, it began to rise. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. Ben finally seemed to snap out of his trance and stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. We watched in horror as the shadow broke the surface, revealing a girl's face, pale and waterlogged. Her hair floated around her like black seaweed, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. "Help me," she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed Ben and bolted, dragging him out of the building and into the night. We didn't stop running until we were back at his car, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, slamming the door behind me. Ben shook his head, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. "I don't know, but it wasn't human." For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her empty eyes staring through me. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fear. But the nightmares didn't stop. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of splashing. At first, I thought it was part of my dream, but as I sat up in bed, I realized it was coming from outside my window. I lived nowhere near a body of water. My chest tightened as I crept to the window and peered out. The street was empty, but the splashing continued, faint and rhythmic. Then I saw it, a puddle on the sidewalk, rippling as if something invisible were moving through it. I slammed the window shut and pulled the curtains, my hands shaking. The next day, I called Ben and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time before saying, "I've been hearing it too. At night, splashes, whispers. Sometimes I think I see her reflection in mirrors just for a second." We agreed never to talk about the pool again. Years later, I moved away from Willow Creek, hoping distance would put the memories behind me. But every so often, I still hear it, the faint sound of splashing, growing louder as if something is trying to find me. And I know, deep down, that I'll never truly escape the abyss. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The community pool in Ridgeline Estates was the pride of the neighborhood, nestled among the upscale homes and manicured lawns. Its pristine waters and tiled deck were the site of countless summer memories for families and kids alike. But beneath the bright surface of laughter and cannonballs, the pool had a dark history. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I was 26, fresh out of college, and renting a small house on the edge of the community. The pool had long since closed for the season, its gates locked and the water covered with a heavy tarp to keep out the autumn leaves. My neighbor, an older man named Mr. Crenshaw, was the one who told me the story of what happened there years ago. "It was the Johnson boy," he said one afternoon, leaning on his rake as we talked over the fence. "Poor kid, only 10 years old. He drowned during a family barbecue. Nobody noticed until it was too late." I frowned. "That's awful, but accidents happen, right?" Mr. Crenshaw shook his head. "It wasn't an accident. At least that's what folks around here say. Some think the pool was cursed even before it was built. People have heard things, seen things. I wouldn't swim there if I were you." I brushed it off as small-town superstition. The Johnson boy's death was tragic, sure, but stories tend to grow legs over time. Still, there was something about the way Mr. Crenshaw's voice dropped, how his eyes darted toward the pool even though we couldn't see it from where we stood. That gave me pause. The pool reopened in the spring, and I didn't think much about the story until my younger sister, Emily, came to visit for the summer. Emily was 16, bubbly and fearless, and immediately decided she wanted to spend her afternoons at the pool. "You should come with me," she said one Saturday morning, already dressed in her swimsuit. "The weather's perfect." I hesitated, remembering Mr. Crenshaw's warning, but then I laughed at myself. It was just a pool. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" The pool was packed that day. Kids screamed as they raced down the slide, parents lounged on deck chairs, and lifeguards barked orders from their posts. Emily dove in immediately, leaving me to find a shady spot near the shallow end. As I sat there sipping from a bottle of water, I noticed something odd. The far end of the pool, near the deep diving section, seemed quieter than the rest. No kids splashed there, no one lounged on the nearby chairs. It was as if an invisible boundary kept everyone away. I chalked it up to coincidence until I saw the lifeguards stationed at that end. A teenage boy with a whistle around his neck. He sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes never leaving the water. Unlike the other lifeguards who laughed and chatted with each other, he looked pale and tense, as if waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" Emily said, suddenly appearing beside me and shaking water from her hair. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head. "No, just that end of the pool. Does it seem weird to you?" Emily turned to look, her brow furrowing. "Yeah, I guess it is kind of empty over there. Creepy, huh?" We both laughed it off, but the feeling stuck with me. That night, I woke up to the sound of splashing. At first, I thought it was just rain, but when I got up and looked out the window, the street was dry. The sound continued, rhythmic and unmistakable, as if someone were swimming laps. I followed the noise to the back door, stepping outside into the cool night air. It was louder now, coming from the direction of the pool. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and slipped on a pair of sneakers. I told myself it was probably teenagers sneaking in for a late-night swim, but the hair on the back of my neck prickled as I made my way toward the gate. The pool was dark, the overhead lights turned off for the night. But as I approached, I could see the tarp covering the water rippling, as though something beneath it was moving. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The splashing stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the tarp began to sag in the middle, as if a heavy weight were pressing down on it. I backed away, my flashlight beam trembling as it danced across the empty deck. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it froze me in place. "Who's there?" I called, my throat dry. The tarp dipped lower and a hand emerged, small, pale, and dripping with water. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back inside the house, locking the door behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. The next morning, I told Emily what had happened. "You're just freaked out because of that story Mr. Crenshaw told you," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's probably just an animal or something." But when we went back to the pool that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced toward the deep end, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The final straw came 2 nights later. Emily and I had just finished dinner when she suggested we take an evening walk around the neighborhood. It was peaceful, the streets quiet under the glow of the streetlights. But as we passed the pool, I stopped. The gate was ajar. "Someone forgot to lock it," Emily said, stepping closer. "Don't," I said, grabbing her arm. But she ignored me, pushing the gate open and stepping inside. The tarp was gone, the water glistening under the moonlight. For a moment it looked serene, almost beautiful. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the diving board. It was a boy, no older than 10, his wet hair clinging to his face. He turned slowly to look at us, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Help me," he said, his voice echoing across the water. Emily screamed, and I pulled her back, slamming the gate shut behind us as we ran. We didn't stop until we were home, our breaths ragged and our faces pale. We never went back to the pool after that. A few weeks later, I moved out of the neighborhood, unable to shake the feeling that the boy was still watching, waiting. To this day, I can't hear the sound of splashing water without freezing, that's my mind flashing back to that night. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of the pool, and in those dreams I see the boy still standing on the diving board, still calling for help.
Story number 7.
The old community center swimming pool had been closed for nearly 20 years when I first laid eyes on it. Overgrown weeds twisted through the cracks in the concrete, and the once clear windows were clouded with grime. I had just moved to Marlow, a sleepy little town in upstate New York, for a fresh start after a messy breakup. My house, a modest rental, was only a few blocks from the abandoned pool, and I passed it every morning during my jogs. "Stay away from there," my neighbor Helen warned one day as I waved to her on my way out. She was an older woman, probably in her 70s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that matched her short, cropped gray hair. "Why?" I asked, curious. "It's just an old pool." Helen hesitated, her lips pursing tightly. "Things happen there. It's bad luck." I shrugged off her warning as small-town superstition, though I couldn't deny the eerie vibe of the place. But one humid summer evening, my curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I decided to explore the pool. I figured it would be a cool story to tell my friends later. The gate, which had once been padlocked, hung loosely on its hinges. I slipped inside, the metal groaning faintly as it swung shut behind me. The air was heavy, the faint smell of chlorine lingering even after all these years. Moonlight spilled across the cracked deck, illuminating the skeletal remains of the pool's diving boards and the murky, stagnant water that filled the deep end. I walked to the edge of the pool, shining my flashlight into the water. The beam cut through the greenish haze, but the bottom was impossible to see. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. It wasn't long before I began to feel foolish for coming. As I turned to leave, a faint sound stopped me in my tracks. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a splash like someone dipping their hand into the water. I froze, shining my light back into the pool. The surface was still, save for a faint ripple that spread out lazily. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. It echoed faintly off the empty walls. No response. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a frog or a bird disturbed by my presence. But then I heard it again, louder this time. Another splash, followed by a faint gurgling sound. "Is someone there?" I demanded, taking a cautious step closer to the edge. The water moved. A shadow appeared just beneath the surface, too large to be an animal. It was shaped like a person. Before I could react, the shadow surged upward. A pale hand broke the surface, its fingers long and impossibly thin. The sight made my stomach churn. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Help me," a voice croaked, hoarse and barely audible. I bolted. My legs felt like lead as I sprinted out of the gate and down the street, not stopping until I was safely inside my house. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the hand, the voice, haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, a trick of the light, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I visited Helen. She opened the door with a knowing look, as if she could tell what I'd seen. "You went there, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, too shaken to lie. Helen sighed, ushering me inside. She made us tea and sat me down at her kitchen table. "I figured you'd be curious," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "I suppose you should know the story." According to Helen, the pool had been the pride of the community when it first opened in the 1970s. Families gathered there every summer, kids splashing and laughing while parents sunbathed on the deck. But everything changed one afternoon in 1996. A boy named Caleb, only 9 years old, had drowned in the deep end. His parents had been distracted, and the lifeguards hadn't noticed him struggling until it was too late. By the time they pulled him out, he was gone. "That was tragic enough," Helen said, stirring her tea. But then the other stories started. I leaned in, my pulse quickening. What stories? People said they saw Caleb in the pool at night. Neighbors heard splashing when no one was there. Some claimed they heard him calling for help, the way he must have when he was drowning. She shivered. The town shut the pool down not long after that. Too many strange things happening. No one wanted to go near it. I left Helen's house, feeling more unnerved than ever. Part of me wanted to forget what I'd seen and stay far away from the pool, but another part of me, a darker, more reckless part, needed answers. That night, I returned. Armed with a stronger flashlight and my phone set to record, I crept back through the broken gate. The air was even heavier than before, thick with the scent of mildew and stagnant water. "Caleb?" I called, my voice echoing across the empty space. "Are you here?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then the splashing started again, soft and rhythmic, as if someone were treading water. My flashlight's beam swept across the surface, but I saw nothing. "Caleb," I said again, my voice shaking, "if you're here, show me." The water in the deep end began to ripple. Slowly, a shape emerged, a boy, his pale face barely breaking the surface. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with an indescribable sadness. "Help me," he whispered. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "I can't," I stammered. You're not supposed to be here." The boy tilted his head, water streaming from his hair. "Neither are you," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. Before I could respond, the water surged upward, and Caleb's face twisted into something horrifying, his mouth gaping wide, his eyes rolling back as if reliving his final moments. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight into the pool. The beam flickered as it sank, illuminating the boy's face for one final, chilling moment before the water swallowed it. I didn't stop running until I was back home, locking every door and window behind me. I didn't sleep that night, or the nights that followed. Eventually, I moved out of Marlow, unable to live so close to the pool and its haunting presence. But even now, years later, I still dream of Caleb. I see him in the water, his pale hand reaching for me, his voice echoing in my mind, "Help me," and I know I never will. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The old swimming pool at Stony Ridge High School was a relic of the past, built in the early 1950s. It sat tucked away in a forgotten wing of the building, far from the bustling classrooms and modern gym. The school's newer pool, sparkling and state-of-the-art, had replaced it decades ago, leaving the old one to gather dust and echo with the memories of a different era. When I first started working as a custodian at Stony Ridge, I heard whispers about the old pool. The other custodians avoided it, claiming it was cursed or haunted. I didn't believe in ghosts, so I volunteered to clean out the area when the school decided to repurpose the wing for storage. "Good luck," my coworker Carl muttered as he handed me the keys. "Don't stay in there too long." I rolled my eyes and waved him off, determined to prove that the stories were nothing more than urban legends. The door to the old pool creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the smell of mildew and stagnant air hitting me like a wave. The pool itself was still filled with water, though it was dark and murky, the filtration system long since broken. The tiles around the edge were cracked, and the once bright mural on the wall had faded into a ghostly shadow of its former self. I set to work clearing the debris that had accumulated over the years. Broken chairs, crumpled papers, and the occasional deflated basketball. The task was tedious but uneventful until I noticed something strange. The water in the pool, despite being stagnant, rippled faintly as if disturbed. I stopped and stared, waiting to see if it was just my imagination. The ripples continued, subtle but undeniable, spreading out from the center of the pool. Probably just an air current, I muttered to myself, though the explanation felt flimsy. I tried to ignore it and went back to work, but the feeling of being watched began to creep over me. Every so often I caught myself glancing back at the water, half expecting to see something or someone there. Then, as I was sweeping near the diving board, I heard it. A splash. The sound was unmistakable, like someone had just jumped into the water. My heart leapt into my throat as I whipped around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The pool was still. No waves, no disturbance. Just the same murky water and the faint ripple pattern I'd noticed earlier. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. No response. I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves getting the better of me. But then it happened again. Another splash, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone gasping for air. "Help me," a voice choked out, faint and desperate. I froze. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but it reverberated through the room with an unnatural echo. "Who's there?" I demanded, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The water in the pool began to churn, the ripples growing into small waves. Slowly, a figure emerged from the center. A boy, his pale face just barely breaking the surface. His eyes were wide and lifeless, his hair clinging to his head in wet strands. "Help me," he said again, his voice distorted as if it were coming from underwater. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. What? What do you want? The boy didn't answer. Instead, he reached out with one pale, skeletal hand, his fingers stretching toward me. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was out of the building and back in the main custodial office. Carl took one look at me and shook his head. You saw him, didn't you? He asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Carl sighed and poured me a cup of coffee. That's Jimmy, he said after a moment. He drowned in that pool back in '72. Some kind of freak accident. They say his spirit's been trapped there ever since. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Why didn't anyone warn me? We tried, Carl said with a shrug. But you didn't believe us. Nobody ever does until they see him for themselves. I didn't go back to the old pool for weeks. I avoided that wing of the school entirely, sticking to the newer parts of the building where the lights were bright and the air felt clean. But the memory of Jimmy stayed with me, haunting my dreams and creeping into my thoughts at odd moments. Finally, one evening, I decided I needed answers. I returned to the old pool, armed with a digital recorder and a sense of determination. The room was just as I'd left it, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. I stood at the edge of the pool, staring into the dark water. Jimmy, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. I know you're here. I just want to talk. The water rippled, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Slowly, the boy's figure rose to the surface again, his lifeless eyes locking onto mine. Help me, he whispered. I crouched down, keeping my distance, but trying to appear calm. What do you need help with? How can I help you? For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he raised his arm and pointed toward the far corner of the pool. I hesitated, then followed his gaze. In the corner, partially obscured by debris, I saw something glinting faintly in the dim light. I approached cautiously, using a long-handled broom to fish the object out. It was a small rusted bracelet, the kind a child might wear, with the name Jimmy engraved on it. As I held it up, the boy let out a sigh, a deep, sorrowful sound that echoed through the room. When I turned back to the pool, he was gone. The water was still again, the ripples fading into nothingness. I kept the bracelet, though I didn't know why. Maybe it was a way to honor him, to remember the boy who had been forgotten in the depths of that cursed pool. After that night, I never saw Jimmy again. The school eventually drained the pool and filled it in, turning the space into a storage room. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that dark water and the boy who reached out for help from beyond the grave, and I wonder if he ever truly found peace. Story.
Story number 9.
The community pool in Willow Creek was the centerpiece of every summer. It had been there for decades, its pristine turquoise water a backdrop to countless family memories. But beneath the surface of laughter and sunshine was a darker history, one the town didn't talk about. When I got the job as a nighttime security guard for the recreation center, the pool was the last place I thought would give me trouble. My shifts were quiet, the most excitement coming from the occasional stray cat or a flickering light in the hallways. The pool was always empty at night, locked up tight after the last swimmers left. Or at least, that's what I thought. It was late August when things started to get strange. My shift began like any other. I did my rounds, checked the doors, and settled into the small office near the front of the building. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint splash echoing down the hall. At first, I thought it might be the plumbing. The building was old and strange noises weren't uncommon, but then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in the pool. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way down the dimly lit corridor. The air grew colder as I approached the pool area, the faint smell of chlorine growing stronger with each step. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the room was eerily silent. The pool stretched out before me, its surface calm and undisturbed. The overhead lights cast a pale glow, reflecting off the water. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the sound. But as I turned to leave, I saw it, a small ripple in the water spreading outward from the deep end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. No response. I shone my flashlight across the pool, scanning the water for any signs of movement. That's when I noticed something odd. Near the deep end, just beneath the surface, there was a shadow, a faint, humanoid shape. My pulse quickened. "If someone's in here, you need to leave," I said, trying to sound authoritative. The shadow didn't move. It hovered there, motionless, almost like it was waiting. Then, slowly, it began to rise. A pale face broke the surface, water streaming down its hollow cheeks. It was a boy, no older than 10, with wide, empty eyes and hair plastered to his forehead. He stared at me, unblinking. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. When I looked back at the pool, the boy was gone. The water was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that day. Instead, I spent hours combing through old news articles about the pool. That's when I found it. In the summer of 1982, a boy named Danny had drowned in the pool during a crowded afternoon. According to the reports, the lifeguards hadn't noticed him struggling until it was too late. Witnesses said they had heard him calling for help, but with all the noise, no one realized what was happening until he slipped beneath the surface. His death had been ruled a tragic accident, and the town moved on. But now, decades later, it seemed Danny hadn't. I considered quitting right then and there, but something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was guilt. Guilt for a boy who had been ignored, whose cries for help had gone unanswered. The next night, I returned to the pool. This time, I brought a recorder and my phone, determined to capture proof of what I had seen. Around midnight, the splashing started again. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as I approached the pool. When I opened the door, the room was filled with the sound of water slapping against tile, though the pool itself was still. "Danny," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you here?" The splashing stopped. The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, the water in the deep end began to ripple. Slowly, the boy emerged again, his pale face breaking the surface. "Help me," he said, his voice echoing with an unnatural distortion. I stepped closer, my phone trembling in my hand as I recorded. "How can I help you?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he raised his arm and pointed toward the far corner of the pool. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The corner he pointed to was dark, the overhead light flickering faintly. I shone my flashlight into the water, but it didn't reach the bottom. Taking a deep breath, I walked around the edge of the pool, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached the corner, I knelt down and peered into the water. At first, I saw nothing. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something glinting faintly at the bottom, a small silver object. I grabbed the long pool net and used it to fish the object out. When I pulled it up, I saw that it was a bracelet, tarnished with age but still intact. The name Danny was engraved on the inside. The moment I held it up, the boy let out a sigh, a soft, sorrowful sound that sent chills down my spine. When I turned back to the pool, he was gone. The water was calm again, the room silent. I left the bracelet on the edge of the pool that night, hoping it would bring him peace. And for a while, it seemed to. The splashing stopped and the pool was quiet during my shifts. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in the building, I still hear faint whispers echoing down the hall. "Help me!"
Story number 10.
The old community swimming pool in my town had been closed for years. It sat at the edge of a sprawling park, fenced off and overgrown with weeds. I always thought it was strange that no one tried to renovate it or tear it down. It was as though the pool itself had been forgotten, left to rot. I used to go there as a kid, back when it was still open. I remember the summers, the smell of chlorine, and the sound of kids splashing and laughing. But there was always something a little off about the place. My parents used to warn me not to wander too close to the deep end, though they never explained why. When I was 24 and back home for the summer, I took a part-time job as a groundskeeper for the park. Most of my work involved mowing the lawns, picking up trash, and maintaining the walking trails. One day, my supervisor asked me to check out the pool area. "Kids keep hopping the fence," he said. "Just make sure nothing's been damaged or left behind." I hadn't been near the pool in years, and the idea of seeing it again intrigued me. I grabbed a flashlight. It was late afternoon, and the shadows were already long, and made my way across the park. The chain-link fence surrounding the pool was rusted, and the gate hung open slightly, creaking in the wind. It didn't surprise me that kids had been sneaking in. The lock was broken, and the whole place felt like it had been abandoned for decades. Inside, the pool was worse than I'd imagined. The water, once clear and inviting, was now a dark, murky green, thick with algae and debris. The tiles around the edge were cracked, and the diving board was splintered and sagging. As I walked along the perimeter, I spotted a few beer cans and some graffiti on the walls, evidence of teenagers looking for a place to hang out. I picked up the cans and made a mental note to come back with paint to cover the graffiti. That's when I heard it. A splash. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the abandoned pool, it was unmistakable. I froze, shining my flashlight across the water. The surface rippled faintly, but the pool was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. No response. I took a step closer to the edge, peering into the murky depths. Something about the water felt wrong. Too dark, too still. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the splash was probably just a frog or a piece of debris falling in. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. Another splash, followed by the faint sound of someone gasping for air. I whipped around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. This time, I saw it. A pale hand breaking the surface, fingers clawing at the water. "Hey!" I shouted, running toward the edge. The hand disappeared beneath the surface before I could reach it. I stared into the water, my heart pounding. There was no sign of anyone, no bubbles, no movement. I thought about jumping in, but the water was so filthy that I couldn't see the bottom. Instead, I grabbed a long pole lying nearby and prodded the water, hoping to feel something. Anything. Nothing. Shaken, I decided to call it a day. I locked the gate as best I could and headed home, telling myself it was just some animal or a trick of the light. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hand reaching out of the water, those pale fingers clawing desperately. By morning, I had convinced myself that I needed to go back. I returned to the pool with a coworker named Mark. He was skeptical when I told him what I'd seen, but agreed to help me check it out. We spent the better part of an hour combing the area. Mark even waded into the shallow end with a net, dragging it through the water, but we didn't find anything. No body, no hand, not even a frog. Probably just a big fish, Mark said, though his tone was less confident than before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few nights later, I was working late, cleaning up after an event in the park. As I was loading trash bags into the truck, I glanced toward the pool. The gate was open again. I grabbed my flashlight and headed over, my stomach twisting with unease. When I reached the pool, the air felt heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that comes before a storm. I shone my light across the water. At first, everything looked normal, still and quiet, the same as before. But then I saw it. A figure was floating in the deep end, face down. "Jesus," I muttered, my heart racing. I dropped my flashlight and scrambled to the edge of the pool. "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't move. I hesitated, then plunged my arm into the water, trying to grab hold of it. My fingers brushed against something cold, freezing, like ice. I yanked my hand back instinctively, and the figure sank beneath the surface. "No," I shouted, leaning closer. But it was gone. The water was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I sat there for a long time, staring into the pool, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I went to the library and looked up the history of the pool. That's when I found the article. In 1986, a boy named Evan had drowned there. He was 10 years old, and no one had noticed he was missing until it was too late. Witnesses said they heard splashing and shouting, but by the time they realized what was happening, Evan had already sunk to the bottom. The details sent a chill down my spine. Later that week, I returned to the pool one last time. This time, I brought a bouquet of flowers. I stood at the edge of the water, my reflection wavering in the murky depths. "Evan," I said, my voice trembling, "I'm sorry no one was there for you. I hope you find peace." I dropped the flowers into the water and watched as they floated to the center of the pool. For a moment, everything was still. Then, faintly, I thought I heard a whisper, soft and distant, carried on the breeze. "Thank you." The pool was torn down the following year, replaced by a skate park. But sometimes when I walk through the park at night, I still hear faint splashes coming from where the pool used to be. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The old swimming pool had been closed for years. It sat in the back of the community center, a forgotten relic from a different time. The paint was chipped, the concrete cracked, and the water had long since turned a murky green, covered with algae and debris. It was a place people avoided, a place of lingering memories of better days when children splashed and laughed in the bright summer sun. I was hired to take care of the community center's grounds one winter, when the center was quiet and deserted. The job mostly involved clearing snow, maintaining the lawn in the spring, and keeping the place generally tidy. I had no particular reason to ever visit the pool. It was far from the main areas where people went. But one day, when I was walking through the center, I noticed a door that led into the pool area had been left ajar. I hadn't even known it was unlocked. Curious, I stepped inside. The air smelled stale and damp, but there was something oddly nostalgic about it, something that made me think of summer days from when I was a kid. But as I walked deeper into the pool room, I felt something else, too. A sense of unease settled over me. There was something wrong about the place. I paused at the edge of the pool, the water black and still, the pool deck cracked and littered with old, discarded equipment. The faint smell of chlorine was still there, though old and faded. I couldn't help but wonder what it must have been like when the pool was in its prime. I heard a noise behind me, a soft splash, like someone had dropped something into the water. I spun around, expecting to see a child or a maintenance worker. The room was empty. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, as though something was watching me. Shaking it off, I walked toward the edge of the pool, looking down into the murky water. There was something strange about the surface, like it was too still, too quiet. The longer I stared, the more I felt an odd pressure in the air, something I couldn't quite explain. Then I saw it. A ripple spread across the water, faint but undeniable. It was like a hand had brushed against the surface, but the pool was empty. I stepped back, my heart rate quickening. I convinced myself it was just the wind, maybe the pipes or something in the old building settling, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I didn't belong here. I hurried out of the room and locked the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been there with me. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the pool. I had never seen the place while it was in use, but something about it felt off, like it was still alive, still holding on to something from the past. One evening, after the center had closed, I was doing some work in the back office when I heard a noise coming from the pool area. It was faint at first, like footsteps echoing across the tiles. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. But when the noise continued, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the pool. When I entered the room, the air felt thick and heavy, like it was holding something inside. The pool was as still as ever, but there was a chill in the air. I shone my flashlight across the water, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then I heard it again, a soft splash. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam flickered as I focused it on the water. For a moment, I saw nothing. But then, just below the surface of the water, I saw something moving. A figure, pale and distorted. It was like a shadow under the water, shifting slowly, as though it were swimming just beneath the surface. I stepped back, my pulse racing. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run. But before I could move, I heard a voice. Help. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but I heard it clearly. It was a child's voice. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to turn and get out of there, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the pool. The shadow under the water was still there, moving slowly. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure in the water seemed to pause, and then, ever so slowly, it began to rise, its pale form becoming more distinct. I stumbled backward as a small face broke the surface, a child, pale and gaunt, with hair clinging to its face. The child's eyes were wide open, staring at me with an unnatural stillness. "Help," the voice repeated, though now it sounded even more distorted, as though it were coming from deep under the water. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The figure's hand slowly reached out from the water, its fingers stretching toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't look away, as the cold, lifeless hand inched closer. Suddenly, the child's face disappeared below the surface, vanishing with a soft splash. The water rippled, and for a moment I thought I saw the figure swimming deeper into the pool. But then, everything was still again. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was safely outside. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the pool. My mind was filled with the image of that child's face, those wide, staring eyes. I felt sick, like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the memory lingered and the days dragged on. The sounds of water splashing in my mind became louder, like an echo I couldn't escape. I returned to the pool one more time, hoping to face whatever I had seen, to understand what it was. But when I arrived at the pool, something had changed. The door was wide open and the pool had been drained. The water was gone, leaving behind nothing but a dry, empty basin. I stood there for a long time, looking down at the cracked tiles and the remnants of the old pool. It was as though everything had been erased. But in the stillness, I thought I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, the faintest echo of water, a ripple in the emptiness. I never went back to the community center after that. I don't know who or what I saw in that pool, but it was real. It wasn't my imagination. And sometimes when the air is still and the silence stretches on too long, I can still hear that voice.
Story number 12.
It was the summer of 2015 when I first noticed something strange about the swimming pool at the old community center. The pool had been closed for years, but its memory had never quite faded from my mind. As a child, I spent countless afternoons there, basking in the sun and laughing with friends. I knew every crack in the tiles, every imperfection in the faded blue paint that lined the edge of the pool. But by the time I was in my 20s, it had become nothing more than a relic, a symbol of better days gone by. The center was still open, but the pool had been abandoned after a series of unfortunate incidents. I'd heard the stories, the rumors of accidents, the tragic drownings, but the truth was nobody really talked about it. It was like everyone agreed to forget. One evening, I was walking through the park when I saw the door to the pool area was slightly ajar. It was late, around 10 p.m., and I hadn't expected anyone to be there. I figured it was just a maintenance worker who had forgotten to lop, or maybe a teenager sneaking in to break a few rules. I approached cautiously, unsure if I should go in, but curiosity got the best of me. The pool was out of sight behind the large brick building, and the only sound I could hear was the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. The pool area was dark, and the lights that once illuminated the water were now broken, leaving everything in shadow. Pushing the door open a bit further, I stepped inside. The smell of stagnant water and mildew hit me immediately. The pool was empty, the water long since drained. The place was eerie, silent, save for the occasional creak of metal or the distant hum of the city. I walked closer to the edge of the pool. The tiles were cracked and dirty, and weeds had begun to grow in the cracks of the cement. The stillness of the place unsettled me. It was like time had stopped here, leaving the pool to decay slowly, forgotten. I shone my flashlight across the pool's bottom, expecting to see nothing but grime and debris. But I saw something else, something I didn't expect. In the center of the pool, near the deep end, there was a figure, a shadowy shape distinct against the cracked, faded tiles. My heart skipped a beat as I blinked, convinced I was seeing things. But no, there it was, still, motionless, the shape of a person lying face down in the water. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I could barely make out details, but there was no mistaking it. A person was lying in the pool, as if they had just collapsed there. But the pool had been empty for years, and I hadn't seen anyone enter. A cold chill ran down my spine, and instinct told me to leave, to turn around and get out of there as quickly as possible. But instead, I found myself walking closer, unable to look away from the strange figure. It was only when I reached the edge of the pool that I realized the shape wasn't floating. It was lying still on the bottom. The air felt thick with something I couldn't describe. It was like the atmosphere itself had changed, pressing in on me, making it harder to breathe. I knelt down to get a better look, my hand shaking as I pointed the flashlight toward the figure. And that's when I saw the face. It was pale, gaunt, and lifeless, eyes wide open but not seeing. The hair was dark, sopping wet, tangled with algae and muck. I gasped, stumbling back. It wasn't possible. It wasn't real. I had to be imagining it. There was no way a person could have been in the pool, lying there, unmoving, after all these years. Then, just as quickly as I had seen it, the face seemed to vanish into the water, sinking out of view. The ripple it caused sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I thought I might faint. I scrambled to my feet and backed away from the pool, my breath quick and shallow. There was no way I was going to get any closer. The air seemed heavier now, thicker, like it was holding something in it. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, barely audible, but it was coming from the direction of the pool. Help! I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was soft, desperate, as if someone was calling from the depths. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice came again, louder this time. Help me! I turned and bolted out of the pool area, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. I didn't stop running until I was safely out of the park, my breath ragged and my heart still racing. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. I thought maybe I'd been exhausted or had imagined it, but I knew deep down that what I'd experienced wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. There was something in that pool, something that had been waiting, trapped, for who knows how long. I decided to go back to the community center that afternoon. I couldn't help myself. I had to see if the pool was still the same. When I arrived, I noticed the door was closed and locked, and the place seemed as quiet as ever. I tried the gate to the pool area, but it was securely latched. For a moment, I considered leaving, but something urged me to try one last time. I walked around the side of the building, hoping to find a way in. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The gate was wide open. I stepped inside, heart hammering in my chest. The pool was just as I had left it, empty, decaying, and silent. But as I approached the edge, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, in the very center of the pool, was a small pile of wet clothing, clothes that had not been there the night before. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around. There was no sign of anyone else. No one had entered the pool area. And yet, the clothes were unmistakably real, soaked and lying discarded on the cracked tiles. I backed away slowly, every instinct telling me to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But just before I turned to go, I heard it again, the faint whisper of a voice. Help! This time it was closer, coming from just beneath the surface of the water. I didn't wait to hear any more. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at my car. I never returned to the community center after that day. To this day, I don't know what happened in that pool. I don't know who or what was calling for help or why I was drawn there in the first place. But I will never forget the face I saw in the water, the voice that still echoes in my mind. Some places, I believe, hold on to things, memories, souls, or something darker, and the pool was one of those places. Story the end.
Story number 13.
The old swimming pool behind Ridgeview High School had been closed for nearly 20 years. Fenced off and overgrown with weeds, it was a ghost of its former self. As a kid, I'd heard the whispers about it, the stories of how it was shut down after the drowning of a student named Emily Hart in 1998. Officially, it was an accident, but rumors swirled. Emily had been a strong swimmer. How could she have drowned in a pool she knew so well? I never gave the pool much thought until my job as a school custodian led me there one October evening. The school had recently hired me to help clean and organize old storage areas, including the derelict pool house. My supervisor, Mr. Jenkins, handed me the keys, his expression grim. "Just take inventory of what's salvageable and clean out any junk," he said. "Don't linger in there longer than you have to." "Why?" I asked, half smiling. "Scared of ghosts?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he muttered, "You'll see," and walked away. The pool house was exactly what I expected. Dusty, damp, and filled with old equipment. Broken lane dividers, rusted starting blocks, and stacks of water-stained papers littered the room. The air smelled faintly of mildew and chlorine, even after all these years. I worked quickly, shoving trash into black garbage bags. The sound of my broom scraping across the tiled floor echoed in the emptiness. Despite the stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At one point, I thought I heard faint splashes, like water lapping gently against the edges of a pool. I stopped and listened, but the sound faded as quickly as it came. I laughed nervously at myself. "Get a grip," I muttered, resuming my work. By the time I finished, the sun had set and the pool area was shrouded in shadows. As I locked up the pool house, I glanced at the fenced-off pool. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the cracked tiles and stagnant water that had pooled at the bottom. That's when I saw it, a ripple. It started in the center of the pool and spread outward, disturbing the still water. My breath caught in my throat. There was no wind, no falling debris, nothing that could have caused it. I told myself it was just my imagination, but as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure small and pale was standing at the far edge of the pool, near the deep end. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It was a girl, maybe 13 or 14, with long, dark hair and a white dress that clung to her body as if it were wet. She was staring at the water, her back to me. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. The girl turned her head slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, and then, in one fluid motion, she stepped into the pool. I ran to the fence, my heart racing. The girl was gone, but the water rippled violently, as if something or someone was thrashing beneath the surface. "Hey!" I shouted, fumbling with the gate. "Hold on, I'm coming!" The gate wouldn't budge. The lock was rusted shut. Panicking, I climbed over the fence and rushed to the edge of the pool, but when I looked down, the water was still. There was no sign of the girl, no sign of movement, just dark, stagnant water and the faint reflection of the moon. I backed away, my hands shaking. "This isn't real. This isn't real," I whispered. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice. "Help me." It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. I spun around, scanning the pool, but it was empty. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." The desperation in her voice sent chills down my spine. Against my better judgment, I leaned over the edge, peering into the water. And that's when I saw her. She was just beneath the surface, her face pale and ghostly, her dark hair floating around her like a veil. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide with fear. She reached out, her hand breaking through the water. "Please," she whispered. Before I could react, something cold and wet wrapped around my ankle. I screamed and stumbled backward, falling onto the cracked tiles. When I looked down, nothing was there. My pant leg was dry. I scrambled to my feet and ran, vaulting over the fence and sprinting back to the school. I didn't stop until I was inside, the door locked behind me. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But the next evening, I had to return to the pool house to finish the job. I considered calling in sick or quitting altogether, but something compelled me to go back. The pool was just as I'd left it, quiet and abandoned. But as I stepped inside the pool house, I noticed something strange. On the dusty floor, there were wet footprints leading from the pool to the storage area. My heart pounded as I followed the trail. The footprints stopped abruptly in front of a locked storage closet. The closet hadn't been opened in years. The lock was rusted, the hinges stiff. But the footprints were fresh, the water still glistening. I unlocked the door, my hands trembling. Inside was a pile of old belongings, swim caps, goggles, and a faded white dress. The dress was damp and it smelled faintly of chlorine. On top of the pile was a photo, its edges warped from moisture. It was a picture of a girl, a teenager with long dark hair, smiling by the edge of the pool. Emily Hart. I dropped the photo and backed away, my chest tight with fear. That night, I dreamed of the pool. In my dream, I was standing at the edge, staring into the water. Emily was there, just beneath the surface, her eyes wide and pleading. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I woke up in a cold sweat, her voice still ringing in my ears. The next day, I quit my job at the school. I couldn't go back, not after what I'd seen. Years later, I learned that Emily's drowning was never fully investigated. Some people believed it was an accident, while others whispered that something darker was at play. I don't know what happened to Emily, but I do know one thing. Her spirit is still there, trapped in that pool, waiting for someone to help her. And sometimes late at night, I can still hear her voice. "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 14.
The apartment complex I moved into during my first year of college wasn't much to look at. The rent was cheap, the walls were thin, and the fixtures were outdated. But what stood out the most was the abandoned swimming pool in the center of the property. Surrounded by a rusting chain link fence, it had clearly been out of use for years. The water, or what was left of it, was stagnant and dark, with algae spreading across its surface. On my first day there, as I was unloading boxes, my neighbor, a wiry old man named Frank, stopped by. He lit a cigarette and eyed me curiously before pointing toward the pool. "Don't go near it," he said. I laughed awkwardly, assuming he was joking. "Why? Is it cursed or something?" His expression didn't change. "Just don't," he said, blowing out a plume of smoke. I shrugged it off. College life was chaotic enough without worrying about an old, unused pool. About a month later, I had mostly settled in. Late one night, unable to sleep, I went out to the balcony of my small unit to get some air. My balcony overlooked the pool, and in the dim glow of the courtyard lights, I noticed something odd. A figure stood by the edge of the pool. At first, I thought it was one of the tenants, but the longer I watched, the stranger it seemed. The figure, a woman, was unnaturally still, her pale face turned toward the water. Her long hair fell in wet, tangled strands, and she wore what looked like an old-fashioned bathing suit. "Who the hell swims in that?" I muttered, shaking my head. As I watched, she stepped forward, disappearing into the murky water. But there was no splash, no ripple, nothing. She just vanished. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, convinced I was seeing things. The pool, as far as I could tell, was empty again. The next morning, I asked Frank about it. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. I hesitated. "What are you talking about?" Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's been years, but she's still here. The girl who drowned." "Drowned?" He nodded. "Back in the 80s, when the pool was still open, a tenant's daughter, about 10 years old, slipped in one night and drowned. They say they found her floating there the next morning, her hair caught in the drain. After that, the pool was shut down." I tried to laugh it off. "You're messing with me, right?" This Frank's expression darkened. "Suit yourself. But I'm telling you, she's still there." I wanted to dismiss it as an old man's attempt to spook me, but I couldn't shake the image of the woman by the pool. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more. Strange sounds late at night, splashing water, faint whispers, even laughter. I told myself it was just the old plumbing or my overactive imagination. But one night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. I checked the door, but no one was there. The knocking continued, though, echoing from somewhere outside. I stepped onto the balcony, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The pool lay below, silent and still, but as I stared down, I saw her again. This time she was in the water. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the dark, and her eyes were wide, staring up at me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the night. I stumbled back, slamming the balcony door shut. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I went to the leasing office and asked about the pool. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stiffened at my question. "Why do you want to know about that?" she asked. I've heard things," I said. "About a girl drowning." She sighed. "Look, it was a long time ago, a tragic accident, but that's all it was. An accident." "Then why does everyone act like the pool's cursed?" She didn't respond, but the way she avoided my gaze spoke volumes. That night, I decided to confront my fear. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed over the chain-link fence and approached the pool. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive silence that makes your ears ring. The water was black, reflecting the faint glow of the courtyard lights. I shone my flashlight across the surface, but it only deepened the shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" For a moment there was nothing, and then a ripple spread across the water. My heart raced as I backed away. "This is stupid," I muttered. But before I could leave, I heard it again. "Help me." The voice was faint but unmistakable. I turned back, and there she was. She was standing in the shallow end, her hair dripping, her eyes locked onto mine. Her lips moved, forming the words over and over again. "Help me." I froze, unable to look away. Her gaze was desperate, pleading as if she was trapped. I don't know how," I stammered. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. Her pale hands reached out toward me, but as she moved, the water began to change. The surface grew turbulent, churning like a storm. And then I saw them, other figures emerging from the depths. Faces twisted in anguish, hands clawing at the surface as if trying to escape. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling to the ground. The beam flickered, casting eerie shadows across the scene. The girl reached the edge of the pool, her fingers grasping the cracked tiles. "Please," she whispered. I turned and ran, the sound of splashing and whispers chasing me all the way back to my apartment. For days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I heard her voice. I felt the cold grip of something I couldn't explain. Eventually, I moved out. I didn't even wait for the lease to end. I packed my things and left, leaving the pool and whatever haunted it behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear her. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 15.
The old neighborhood pool was the center of every summer memory I had as a kid. It wasn't anything fancy, just a public swimming pool surrounded by a chain link fence. But it was always packed with kids. I remember the smell of chlorine, the sharp heat of the sunburn on my shoulders, and the sound of splashing and laughter echoing through the air. But that was years ago. By the time I came back as an adult, the pool had been closed for over a decade. They said it was because of budget cuts, but there were other stories too. Stories people whispered, even back when I was a kid. I hadn't thought about the pool in years until my younger sister, Hannah, brought it up. She was staying at my place for the summer, bored out of her mind in the small, sleepy town. "You remember the old pool?" she asked one night over dinner. "Of course," I said. "Why?" "I heard some kids talking about it in the park. They said it's haunted." I laughed. "That's been a rumor forever." "They said they saw a girl there," she continued, her voice lowering. "A girl in the water." I raised an eyebrow. "What girl?" "Apparently she drowned," Hannah said, leaning closer. "They say she pulls people into the water with her." "Sounds like a campfire story," I said, brushing it off. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the pool. I remembered hearing something like that when I was younger. I even recalled a name, Katie, a girl who had drowned one summer. It was a vague memory, half-formed and distant, but it stuck with me. The next day, I decided to check it out. It was mostly curiosity, but a part of me wanted to see the place again, to see if it was as I remembered. The pool was easy to find, hidden behind an overgrown chain-link fence on the edge of the neighborhood. The gates were padlocked, but the fence had been cut open at some point, leaving a gap big enough to slip through. The area was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and rotting leaves. The pool itself was worse than I imagined. The once clear water was now dark and murky, covered in algae and debris. The diving board was broken, its base rusted, and the poolside chairs were overturned, their plastic frames cracked. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It felt smaller than I remembered, like so many childhood landmarks do. But there was something else, a feeling I couldn't quite place. I thought I heard a splash, faint and distant, but when I turned toward the water, it was still. "Hannah's story got into your head," I muttered to myself. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange on the far side of the pool. A faint movement in the water, like ripples spreading outward. I froze. There was no breeze, no falling debris. But the water continued to ripple as if someone had just slipped beneath the surface. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The ripples faded and the water went still again. But as I stood there, staring into the murky depths, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I left in a hurry, telling myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination. But that night, I dreamed of the pool. In my dream, I was standing at the edge, looking down into the water. It was clear and blue, just like I remembered from childhood. But then, slowly, a face appeared beneath the surface, a girl's face. Her hair floated around her like dark seaweed, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. She reached for me, her hand breaking the surface, and I woke up gasping. The next morning, Hannah noticed how pale I looked. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." She smirked. "You went to the pool, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but my silence was enough. "I knew it," she said. "Did you see her?" "There's no her, Hannah," I snapped. "It's just a creepy abandoned pool." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started hearing things at night, soft splashes, faint whispers, even laughter. It sounded distant, like it was coming from the direction of the pool. One night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence of the house. I got out of bed, my heart racing, and checked the front door. No one was there. The knocking continued, though, louder now. It seemed to be coming from the back door. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick and humid. I turned toward the pool, which was just visible through the trees. And there she was. A girl stood at the edge of the pool, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, dripping with water, and she wore a faded white dress. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. "Who are you?" I called out. She turned slowly, her movements unnatural, almost jerky. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark. "Help me," she whispered. Before I could react, she stepped into the pool, disappearing beneath the surface. I ran toward the fence, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached the pool, the water was calm again, as if nothing had happened, but I knew what I'd seen. The next day, I told Hannah everything. She listened intently, her face pale. "We need to do something," she said. "Like what?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted, "but she's clearly trying to tell us something." We started researching, digging through old newspapers and online archives. Eventually, we found it, a small article from 1986 about a girl named Katie Miller who had drowned in the neighborhood pool. She was 10 years old, and the article described her as a strong swimmer. Her death was ruled an accident, but the details were vague. Something about it didn't sit right with me. That evening, we went back to the pool. Armed with flashlights and a sense of determination, we climbed through the gap in the fence. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. "Katie?" Hannah called out. Nothing. We approached the edge of the pool, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The water was as murky as ever, but then, in the beam of light, we saw it. A pale hand reached up from the water, fingers splayed. Hannah screamed, but I grabbed her arm, holding her steady. "Katie," I said, my voice trembling, "we're here. What do you want?" The hand slowly sank back into the water, and for a moment everything was still. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, indistinct, but they grew louder, surrounding us. "Help me," the voice said, over and over, and then we saw her. Katie's face appeared beneath the surface, her wide eyes locked onto ours. She reached out, her expression desperate, pleading. Without thinking, I stepped closer, leaning over the edge. "Don't!" Hannah cried, pulling me back, but it was too late. My foot slipped, and I fell into the water. The cold was shocking, the weight of it dragging me down. I struggled, my vision blurring, and then I saw her. Katie was right in front of me, her face inches from mine. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She pointed toward the bottom of the pool, and for a moment, I saw something glinting in the darkness. A bracelet. I grabbed it, my lungs burning, and kicked my way to the surface. Hannah helped me out of the pool, her hands shaking. "What happened?" she asked. I held up the bracelet. It was small and delicate, with a name engraved on it, Katie. That night, we left the bracelet at the edge of the pool, along with a bouquet of flowers. The whispers stopped. I don't know if Katie found peace, but I haven't seen her since. Story, the end.
Story number 16.
I first noticed the pool at Oakwood Apartments on a damp September evening when the sun hung low, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. I'd just moved into the complex, desperate for cheap rent and a fresh start. The pool sat in the center of the courtyard, an oblong pit of murky, greenish water surrounded by an old wrought iron fence. It was obvious no one had swum there in years. "Hey, what's the deal with the pool?" I asked Julie, the property manager, as she handed me my keys. Her smile faded. "We don't use it. Liability reasons, too expensive to fix." Her tone discouraged further questions, but something about the way she avoided eye contact stuck with me. That night, unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I found myself glancing out the window toward the pool. The streetlights cast an eerie glow over its surface, which barely moved despite the breeze. Something about it felt wrong. It was too quiet. By the second week, I'd started to hear whispers about the pool from my neighbors. Apparently, a boy had drowned there years ago, a kid named Ben who had lived in the complex with his family. The details varied depending on who you asked. Some said it was an accident, others hinted at something darker. Either way, the pool had been abandoned ever since. I brushed it off as local lore, the kind of story people tell to make their dull lives more interesting. But that changed the night I woke up to the sound of splashing. It was faint at first, just a rhythmic lapping of water. Groggy and annoyed, I checked the clock. 2:13 a.m. I got out of bed, walked to the window, and looked out. The pool was empty. The water was still. I sighed, blaming my overactive imagination, and crawled back into bed. But the sound came again the next night, louder this time. Splashing, like someone was swimming back and forth. Again, when I looked, there was nothing. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The courtyard was silent except for the faint hum of the streetlights. As I approached the pool, the air grew colder, and the smell of stagnant water hit me. I shone the flashlight over the surface. It was filthy, full of debris and algae. Nothing moved. But then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a ripple. Small at first, but then another and another. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns as if someone was just below the surface. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The ripples stopped. I backed away, my heart pounding, and returned to my apartment. I didn't sleep that night, haunted by the image of the dark water and its unnatural stillness. A few days later, I ran into a neighbor, an older man named Rick, who had lived at Oakwood for over 20 years. I asked him about the pool. "Ah," he said, shaking his head, "you don't want to mess with that pool." "Why not?" he sighed, his eyes darting toward it. "The boy, Ben, he drowned there, 15 years ago? Maybe more. No one knows how he got in. His parents swore he never went near the pool, but they found him in the deep end, face down." He lowered his voice. "Some people think he never left." I laughed nervously. "You're saying the pool's haunted?" "I'm saying it's best to leave it alone," Rick said. "Trust me." But I couldn't leave it alone. The noises continued, splashing, soft laughter, even faint voices that sounded like a child calling out. I started avoiding my window, keeping the curtains drawn at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the pool was watching me. Then one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed when I heard it again, louder than ever. Splashing, followed by a voice, clear and distinct. "Help me." I froze. It was a boy's voice, high-pitched and panicked. I told myself it wasn't real, but then I heard it again. "Help me." It sounded closer this time, desperate. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight and ran outside. The courtyard was empty, but the voice came again, this time louder, echoing in the still night air. "Help me." I shone the flashlight toward the pool and gasped. A small figure was in the water, thrashing wildly, struggling to stay afloat. Without thinking, I ran to the edge. "Hold on," I shouted. "I'm coming." I climbed the fence and jumped in. The water was freezing and the smell of decay was overwhelming. I swam toward the figure, but as I got closer, it vanished. I stopped, treading water, my heart racing. There was nothing there. And then I felt it. A hand, cold and small, grabbing my ankle. I screamed, kicking frantically, but the grip tightened, pulling me down. The water closed over my head and I struggled to break free, but it was like something was dragging me deeper. Through the murky water, I saw a face, a boy, pale and lifeless, his eyes wide and unblinking. I don't know how I managed to get out. One moment I was sinking, the next I was on the pool deck, coughing up water. The courtyard was silent again, the pool calm and still. But I knew what I'd seen. The next day, I packed my things and moved out. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, afraid they'd think I was crazy. But I couldn't stay there, not after that night. It's been years since I left Oakwood, but I still think about the pool. I wonder if Ben is still there, waiting, calling out for someone to help him. Sometimes late at night, I hear his voice in my dreams. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 17.
The municipal pool on the outskirts of town was a relic of the 1970s. Cracked tiles, rusted railings, and a faded mural of smiling dolphins gave the place an eerie, forgotten charm. As a teenager, I worked there as a lifeguard during summer breaks. It wasn't glamorous, but the money was decent, and it beat sweating through a fast food shift. Everyone who worked there knew the story of the girl who drowned. Her name was Emily, a quiet, shy kid who supposedly slipped into the deep end during an overcrowded family swim session back in 1982. By the time anyone noticed she was missing, it was too late. The story was whispered among lifeguards as a kind of initiation, but no one took it seriously, at least not until strange things started happening. It was my second summer at the pool, and by then I knew the routine. Weekdays were slow, with only a handful of kids splashing in the shallow end and a few older patrons doing lazy laps. The nights, however, were a different story. I had agreed to cover the closing shift for another guard who'd called in sick. That meant staying until 10 p.m., locking up, and making sure everything was secure. The first hour after sunset was uneventful. The pool emptied out, leaving the water dark and still under the dim glow of the overhead lights. I walked the perimeter, gathering stray towels and pool noodles, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. As I bent down to retrieve a forgotten pair of goggles, I heard it. A soft splash, barely audible. I straightened up, scanning the pool. The surface was calm. I told myself it was probably just the filtration system kicking on and went back to work. But the splashing continued, faint but rhythmic, like someone treading water. A chill ran down my spine. The pool was supposed to be empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing, "We're closed." No response. I stepped closer to the edge, peering into the deep end. The water was black, reflecting the orange glow of the overhead lights. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it. A ripple spreading outward as though someone had just slipped beneath the surface. My chest tightened. "Is someone in there?" I shouted louder this time. Still nothing. I grabbed the long pole we used to fish out leaves and debris and cautiously dipped it into the water. It sank easily, meeting no resistance. Whatever had caused the ripple was gone. Trying to shake off the unease, I finished my tasks and locked up for the night. But I couldn't stop thinking about the splash. The next morning, I asked my coworker Sarah if she'd ever experienced anything strange during the night shifts. She hesitated before answering. "Once," she said. I was closing up and I thought I saw someone sitting on the diving board, but when I got closer, there was no one there. "Did you check the pool?" I asked. She nodded. It was empty, but I swear I saw something. Her words stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more odd occurrences. The lane ropes would shift positions overnight, though no one had used them. Pool toys left in the shallow end would end up floating in the deep end by morning. And there was always that faint, persistent sound of splashing when no one was around. One night, I decided to stay late and figure out what was going on. Armed with a flashlight, I sat on a lounge chair near the deep end, waiting. The hours crawled by, and I began to feel foolish. Maybe it really was just the filtration system or my imagination getting the better of me. At around 11:30, I heard it again. A splash, followed by a faint ripple that spread across the water. My pulse quickened. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the pool. The beam illuminated the surface, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw her. A figure was standing in the water, waist deep, her back turned to me. Her long, dark hair clung to her neck and shoulders, and she wore what looked like an old-fashioned one-piece swimsuit. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're not supposed to be here." She didn't respond. I stepped closer to the edge, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Do you need help?" I asked. Slowly, she began to turn. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as though she were a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. When she faced me, I froze. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with water dripping from her hollow, lifeless eyes. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then she began to sink, her body vanishing beneath the surface without a single ripple. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I stared at the pool, now calm and still. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but I couldn't shake the image of her face. The next day, I told my manager about what I'd seen. She gave me a long, hard look before speaking. "Emily," she said quietly, "you're not the first person to see her." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "You're serious?" She nodded. "I've worked here for 20 years. There have always been stories, people hearing splashes, seeing shadows, feeling like they're being watched. We've tried to ignore it, but, well, you've seen her now." I quit my job a week later. I couldn't bear to go back, not after what I'd experienced. Even now, years later, I can't pass by that pool without feeling a chill. I've heard it's still open, still drawing in new lifeguards every summer. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if Emily is still there, waiting for someone to notice her. Story the end.
Story number 18.
The summer I turned 17, I got a part-time job as a lifeguard at Fairview Aquatic Center, a small, aging public pool that had seen better days. Most of the staff were high school kids like me, looking for easy work, a bit of pocket money, and a chance to soak up the sun. The pool had a reputation for being a little rundown, with faded lane markers, chipped tiles, and an ancient diving board that creaked ominously when anyone used it. What people didn't talk about, at least not in front of the customers, was the story of the boy. The details varied depending on who told it, but the basics were always the same. A child had drowned in the pool years ago, sometime in the late 1980s. His name was Charlie, and he was said to have been a quiet, timid kid who didn't know how to swim. One day he wandered into the deep end while no one was looking. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. I heard the story my first week on the job from Luke, another lifeguard who'd been there for 3 summers already. He told it with a smirk, clearly enjoying the way the new hires hung on his every word. "They say he still hangs around," Luke said, lowering his voice. "Sometimes when it's quiet, you'll see ripples in the water, like someone's swimming, or you'll hear splashing when there's no one there. And if you're really unlucky," he paused for effect, "you'll see him." "Bull," I said, rolling my eyes. "You're just trying to scare us." "Maybe," Luke replied, grinning, "but don't say I didn't warn you." I didn't believe him, of course. Why would I? Ghost stories were for campfires and horror movies, not real life. Still, the pool did feel strange at night. The lights flickered sometimes, casting long, distorted shadows over the water, and when the place was empty, the silence was heavy, almost oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination. That all changed one evening when I was closing up alone. It had been a slow day, with only a handful of swimmers in the afternoon. By the time the last family left, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the pool was bathed in a dim, orange glow. I went through my usual routine, stacking chairs, rolling up lane ropes, and skimming the surface of the water for leaves and debris. As I was locking the gate to the kiddie pool, I heard it, a faint splash coming from the deep end. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Turning slowly, I scanned the pool. The surface was calm, the water still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. "We're closed. If you're in there, you need to leave." No response. I walked to the edge of the deep end, my sandals slapping against the wet concrete. The water was dark, reflecting the overhead lights. I peered into the depths, but there was nothing there. No ripples, no movement. I told myself it was probably just the filtration system kicking on, even though it didn't usually make noise like that. Shaking my head, I turned to leave. Then I heard it again. Splash. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It sounded like someone treading water. I spun around, my stomach tightening. "I'm serious," I shouted. "If this is a joke, it's not funny." The water was moving now, small ripples spreading outward from the center of the deep end. I grabbed a flashlight from the lifeguard station and aimed it at the pool. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the surface. For a moment, everything was still. And then I saw it. A small figure was floating just beneath the surface, face down. The body was pale, almost translucent, with dark hair fanned out around its head. My breath caught in my throat. It looked like a child. "Hey!" I shouted, dropping the flashlight and running to the edge. "Are you okay?" Without thinking, I dove in. The water was colder than I expected, sending a shock through my system. I swam toward the figure, my arms cutting through the water in powerful strokes. But as I got closer, it began to sink, drifting slowly toward the bottom. "No!" I gasped, diving deeper. My fingers brushed against something solid, and I grabbed hold, pulling it toward me. But when I surfaced, coughing and sputtering, my arms were empty. The figure was gone. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. The pool was empty, the water calm once more. I swam to the edge and hauled myself out, shivering despite the warm night air. My clothes clung to my skin, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the water. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the weight of the thing I'd grabbed, it had felt real. Solid. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But from that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone when I was at the pool. I started hearing faint splashes again, even during the day. Once, I thought I saw a shadow moving beneath the water, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. My last shift of the summer was another closing shift. I was relieved to be done with the job, ready to put the whole experience behind me. But as I was locking up for the night, I heard it one final time, a splash. followed by a soft, childlike giggle. I didn't look back. To this day, I can't go near a pool without feeling a chill run down my spine. I don't know what I saw that night, and maybe I never will. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I think about Charlie. I wonder if he's still there, waiting for someone to notice him. Story the end.
Story number 19.
The community pool where I worked one summer was small and unassuming, nestled in the heart of our sleepy little town. It was surrounded by chain-link fencing draped with wilting ivy, and its water always carried a faint chemical tang from decades of overchlorination. To most people, it was a place of joy, a hub for cannonballs, swim lessons, and long afternoons of summer heat. To me, it became something else entirely. The story of the pool ghost wasn't mentioned in my job interview. No one sat me down to explain that, decades ago, a girl had drowned during a late-night swim, or that her death had never quite let go of the place. I didn't learn that until after my first encounter. It was mid-July, and I had just been promoted to the closing shift. The promotion wasn't glamorous. It mostly involved sweeping, scrubbing the locker rooms, and locking up. But I liked the quiet. Once the last kids left and the pool went silent, it was oddly peaceful, the water smooth as glass under the dim floodlights. One night, as I was rolling up the lane ropes, I heard it. The soft plunk of water breaking. It was faint, like a small splash or the sound of someone slipping beneath the surface. I froze, the coil of rope in my hands growing heavy. The pool was supposed to be empty. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. No answer. The water lay still. Shaking my head, I told myself it was the filtration system. That old thing made all sorts of noises when it kicked on, gurgling and hissing as it struggled to keep the water circulating. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The following week, I started hearing splashes more often. Sometimes it was just the faintest plop, barely audible over the hum of the lights. Other times it was louder, more deliberate, as though someone had dived in. Each time I rushed to the edge, heart pounding, only to find the pool empty. I told myself it was my imagination. Long hours and too much caffeine could mess with your head, after all. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, after locking the front gate, I lingered by the pool. The lights cast shimmering reflections on the water, and the air was thick with the scent of chlorine. I was about to leave when I saw it. A shadow. It flickered across the bottom of the deep end, dark and fleeting, like a figure swimming just beneath the surface. My breath hitched, and I stepped closer, gripping the edge of the pool. The shadow disappeared. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The pool remained silent. I leaned over, squinting into the water. My reflection stared back, distorted by the ripples spreading outward from the center of the pool. And then, just for a moment, I saw her. A face. It was pale, almost translucent, with dark, empty eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. Her hair floated around her like seaweed, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the wet concrete. When I looked again, the face was gone. The water was calm. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The next day, I asked my coworker Sarah if she'd ever seen anything strange at the pool. She hesitated before answering. "You mean the ghost?" My stomach dropped. "What ghost?" Sarah glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. "A girl drowned here, years ago before we were born. They say she haunts the pool. Why didn't anyone tell me?" She shrugged. "It's just a story. No one really believes it." But I did. Over the next few weeks, the activity escalated. Doors in the locker room slammed shut on their own. Pool toys left in the shallow end would show up in the deep end the next morning. And always, there were the splashes. The faint, rhythmic sound of someone treading water when no one was there. One night, I decided to stay late. I told myself I was just being thorough, making sure the pool was clean and the gates were secure. But really, I wanted answers. I brought a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, settling into a lounge chair by the deep end. The hours crawled by, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of the filtration system. At around midnight, I heard it. The splash. I jumped to my feet, aiming the flashlight at the water. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the surface. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw her. She was standing in the water, waist deep, her back to me. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands, and her shoulders were hunched as though she were shivering. She didn't move. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. Slowly, she began to turn. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. When she faced me, I froze. Her face was as I remembered, pale, lifeless, with empty eyes that seemed to pull me in. She raised a hand, beckoning, and then began to sink. Her body disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only a faint ripple behind. I didn't run. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped closer to the edge, peering into the water. For a moment, I thought I saw her, floating just beneath the surface. But when I blinked, she was gone. I quit my job the next day. I didn't tell my manager why, and I didn't need to. The look in her eyes told me she already knew. Years later, I still think about that pool. I wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone to notice her. I wonder if she'll ever leave. But most of all, I wonder if she remembers what happened to her, or if she's trapped, reliving it, over and over again.
Story number 20.
The pool was a relic of my childhood, a sprawling municipal monstrosity surrounded by faded murals of grinning dolphins and seahorses. It sat at the edge of town where rows of pine trees marked the beginning of dense, untouched forest. Everyone called it the Pines Pool, but no one remembered its real name. For years, it had been the heart of summer, a place of laughter, splashing, and sunburns. But there was something about it, even in broad daylight, that felt off. As kids, we whispered about it, making up stories of people who'd gone missing or drowned. As adults, we brushed those tales aside, chalking them up to overactive imaginations. When I took a job as a maintenance worker there the summer I turned 23, I didn't think about those stories. I just needed the money. My shifts were mostly early mornings or late evenings when the pool was empty and the stillness made the space feel larger, hollow. That's when I noticed it. The silence. The Pines Pool didn't hum the way other places did. Even the usual sounds of insects or passing cars seemed muted, as though the air around the pool had been dampened. One night, my shift dragged later than usual. I was the only one left, tasked with scrubbing algae off the tiles near the deep end. The lights overhead buzzed weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the water. It was quiet, save for the occasional echo of my brush against the tiles. Then I heard it. A splash. I stopped mid-scrub, heart hammering. The water in the deep end rippled faintly, as though someone had jumped in moments before. I stood up, scanning the pool. It was empty. The gates were locked. I was alone. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. No response. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the filtration system had kicked in or a stray leaf had fallen. Still, the hair on my arms stood on end as I packed up my tools and hurried toward the locker room. Before I reached the door, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, unmistakable, a splash followed by faint, rhythmic ripples, as though someone were treading water. I turned back, my stomach twisting. The surface of the water shimmered under the flickering lights, but it was still. Too still. Swallowing hard, I walked back to the edge of the pool and peered into the deep end. For a moment, there was nothing, just dark, empty water. Then, I saw it. A figure was floating just beneath the surface, pale and motionless. My breath caught. It was small, child-sized. The face was obscured by hair that fanned out like seaweed, but the body didn't move, didn't react. It was as though it were frozen in time. My instincts kicked in. Without thinking, I ran to the lifeguard station, grabbed the long pole with the hook, and rushed back. I plunged it into the water, trying to snag the figure, but it slipped through, as though it wasn't solid. I leaned closer, desperate to see more clearly. The figure began to sink, drifting slowly toward the bottom of the pool, and then it was gone. I staggered back, my pulse racing. My first thought was to call the police, but what would I even say? That I saw something in the pool that disappeared into thin air? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that lifeless figure, floating just beneath the surface. The next morning, I told my coworker, Jake, about what I'd seen. He laughed at first, but his smile faded when he saw how shaken I was. "You've heard the story, right?" he asked. "What story?" Jake leaned closer, lowering his voice. "About the boy. It happened back in the 80s. He was here on a school trip, got separated from his group. They think he slipped into the deep end when no one was watching. They didn't find his body until hours later." I stared at him, horrified. "Why would you tell me that now?" He shrugged, his expression grim. because some people say he never left. I wanted to believe Jake was just messing with me, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't. And as the days passed, the strange occurrences grew more frequent. Splashes in the water when no one was around, wet footprints on the concrete even when the pool had been dry for hours. Once, I found a small waterlogged toy boat drifting in the shallow end. No one had seen it before, and no one claimed it. The final straw came one evening when I was closing up alone again. I had just finished locking the front gate when I heard a faint childlike laugh echo from the pool area. My stomach turned. Against my better judgment, I went back. The pool was empty, the water eerily calm. But as I turned to leave, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A small boy was standing at the edge of the deep end, his back to me. He was soaking wet, water dripping from his clothes and hair onto the concrete. "Hey!" I called, my voice trembling. "The pool's closed. You shouldn't be here." He didn't respond, didn't move. Slowly, I approached, my heart pounding. "Are you okay?" I asked, softer this time. The boy turned. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, empty pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Before I could react, he stepped backward and fell into the pool. I ran to the edge, panic surging through me. The water was churning, frothing as though something massive had just plunged in. But when it stilled, there was nothing. The boy was gone. I quit the next day. I didn't give a reason, didn't care about the paycheck I was leaving behind. I just wanted to get as far away from that pool as possible. Even now, years later, I can't look at a swimming pool without feeling a chill. I don't know what I saw that summer. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe it was something worse. But one thing I do know, the Pines Pool is no place for the living. Story the end.